Now, as we hone in on the state, the health of our planet and our environment, it's time to take you back into the wild. So we recently reported on a new study by the World Wildlife Fund that painted a pretty grim picture, to speak plainly, of what the world might look like by the end of the century if something is not done to combat climate change. Now, many species of plants and animals might become extinct. In fact, we're seeing it happening as we speak, and the effects are already starting to be felt in our own very protected wildlife areas here on South African soil and Southern Africa, all over the continent. We're joined this morning by a man who studies this impact for a living, and I think is fairly emotionally invested in this as well. Kevin Coldrey from Anchor Environmental. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a scary thing when I'm starting to talk about all these dark truths of where the environment is at the moment, and my guest is going, yep, no, extinction is there, yep, the world is changing. Yeah. When I talk about protected areas, is there such a thing as a truly protected area anymore? What are we talking about when we define something as a protected area? Okay, so to get a little technical, a protected area is a clearly defined geographical space, which is managed for the long-term conservation of nature as well as cultural heritage. So that a perfect world is what you're saying. It's in a perfect world. What are we protecting these areas from? Is it environmental damage? Is it natural factors? Is it human? Well, see, our protected areas are conserving our biodiversity from human interference. That's essentially what they're established for. But the human interference components are quite broad in the sense that it can be habitat loss, there's alien species, disease, changes to freshwater flows, as well as resource use. And then climate change is that pressure on top of all of these that has the potential to just exacerbate many of these issues. And it's such murky water, excuse the pun, when we talk about climate change, because it's difficult to know where the battle needs to be waged. It's become a very political thing in a number of countries globally. What effects have you noticed? And I'm sure it's quite a complex issue, but what's leapt out off the page for you when it comes to climate change? Yeah, so my focus for the past year or so has been on developing a method to assess the vulnerability of protected areas to climate change. And so my focus has really been on understanding the potential impacts of climate change on our protected areas. And when we think of that, we must remember that it's not only the impact on our biodiversity, like the species and ecosystems within protected areas, but it's also the more socio-economic aspects, that affect the functioning of protected areas, such as tourism. There's climate impacts on tourism. It can reduce the number of tourist arrivals when it becomes too uncomfortable to visit these parks in summer season. There's relations with neighboring communities as they feel the pressure of climate change and some of the extreme events. The neighboring communities are forced to rely more on parks for natural resources. And then there's also the risk to the infrastructure within the protected areas as well, through flooding and so on. Yeah, where do you even begin, I suppose, when addressing this? But I think we're going to take a look at the more extreme side of the story and just how, I think, damaged the Earth is and if there is a way back from that. But a very, very interesting discussion. We are talking about climate change specifically. This morning obviously becomes really relevant when we look at the water crisis and drought here in the Western Cape and parts of the Eastern Cape. I want to know if that's a direct result of climate change or we're just living in a desert. But stay tuned. Very, very interesting discussion. It's my feel-good breakfast show. Welcome back. You're live with Expresso. Thank you so much for joining us for the second and final hour of the show. Let's head back into the wild. We are talking about climate change this morning as we take you into the wilds, and of course a shrinking wild, I think largely due to climate change, yes, but also our impact as humans on protected areas. And what exactly is a protected area? Well, we've been finding out from Kevin Coldrey from Anchor Environmental, who explores this space as a daily grind, I would imagine, when you look at how much negativity is attached to that. Are we in a crisis mode when we look at climate change globally? Should we believe Donald Trump, or should we believe what seems to be jumping out at us? How bad is the situation?
Look, climate change it's real. And it's not something that's going to happen 30, 40 years from now. It's happening right now as we speak. As I mentioned, my focus has largely been in the protected area space and really looking at South Africa's protected areas. But if I look at the Richtersveld National Park, in looking at sort of 2016 figures, the Richtersveld has already experienced the climate change that was predicted for 2030, with 2 or 3 degrees Celsius increase at the moment. So it's very difficult to listen to the likes of Trump and so on who's denying the fact that it exists when it's happening all around us.
Well, I think this is the unfortunate reality, and we've seen it with the water crisis, where these things have become political, and understandably so, where humans meet nature. It's not just a simple kind of battlefield. It's going to be complex. There's going to be a socio-economic element through that. Talking about water specifically, last week was World Water Day. And obviously that's a massive topic here. I cannot believe, and I say it with a huge amount of pride, how far South Africans have come, how far Cape Townians have come. Moving down to up to 25 litres of water a day is an amazing thing. Nowhere else, no other city in the world has been able to come close to that. I think the previous record was 50, but there is still this sense of panic. How does climate change affect our water? Are we becoming a desert here? Is this drought going to last forever? How do you see the water side of the
Yeah. So when it comes to water, remember that the climate change is going to vary across the country. So some areas of the country are set to receive more water, while other areas are set to receive less. So it's difficult to say specifically that from a country perspective, this is what's going to happen. But generally speaking, we can say that the more western regions of the country are likely to experience a drier climate, while the eastern side and some of the northern parts are actually expected to experience slightly wetter climate. But the one thing we can say with some certainty is that the rainfall is going to become more variable across the country. And this often leads to extreme climatic events like flooding and droughts, which is something that we can, expect to happen more often.
And of course, with the soil, what's happened to that land after droughts, and then the flooding becomes that much more extreme. Well, you handled that like a politician, by the way. That was a very good answer there. Is enough being done? Is something being done on a global scale to protect biodiversity? Because we are part of a global village, surely.
Yes, and most certainly. So in 2010, governments around the world came together to sign a global plan to protect biodiversity. And this plan includes 20 targets known as the Aichi biodiversity targets, which, together with the Sustainable Development Goals, constitute the most important biodiversity and sustainable developments ever signed on in terms of commitments from governments around the world.
So something is being done. I absolutely love that. Well, we're going to talk about what we can do as South Africans, maybe South African companies. I don't know where we need to begin with that, but we are talking about climate change and how it's affecting us here in South Africa and our protected areas. We'll continue the discussion with Kevin in just a moment.
It's my feel-good breakfast show.
From that deliciousness, let's continue our rather sobering chat as we head back into the wild. Welcome back. As we head back into the wild, we often take a look at our wildlife concerns from the source of a wildlife, maybe conservationist, but we're taking a slightly different stance this morning. And yes, he is a conservationist. It's very much a part of his DNA, but he comes in the form of being an environmental economist. We've been chatting to Kevin Coldrey, who works for Anchor Environmental, and really interesting, because I think you are being forced to do studies in areas where it would not only just impact the environment, but impact the socio-economic side and communities. Really, really interesting space at the moment. When we look at climate change, what can we actually do about it? What is being done in South Africa? What do you advise your clients, people who come to you, to do about climate change?
Sure, it's a very interesting question because on the one hand, you've got what we can do as a country, as a continent, as a globe, as Earth, and that's to reduce emissions of carbon dioxide, and that's something that needs to be taking center stage, and that's on the one side. That's essentially mitigating the future risk.
Are we moving fast enough in that regard, or do we need a bigger change?
No, we definitely are not. At the moment, we are tracking the worst case scenario in terms of climate change scenarios.
All right, so then the flip side of that coin.
Yeah, on the other side, we need to start focusing on adapting to climate change. So, we need to also swallow the pill and say, look, it is coming. And what can we do now to start, building resiliency and adapting to what the new environment is going to look like? And Cape Town's a fantastic, case, in the sense that we are going to have to reduce the consumption of water, and we've shown that we can do it.
We very much can, and in a very short amount of time, I think as well. When you look at the big picture, if I had to ask you to do a 20, 30, 50-year forecast here, what do you think the big gateways are going to be, the biggest challenges moving ahead? Do we have ground zeros anywhere out there that you can see?
Sure. That is a challenging question. I think in terms of protected areas, so I'm just going to come back to this point for a second.
The politician comes out there.
But in terms of protected areas, I think what we need to be looking at is, okay, because climate change has the potential to force species to actually change their range, to shift their distribution into new areas, we need to start looking at not only expanding protected areas into corridors where species can move through to remain within their climate limits, but we also need to start looking at where we can establish new protected areas that can conserve the biodiversity of the future. And the same can be said for the rest of the country, not just specifically protected areas, looking at communities that are vulnerable to climate change at present. The adaptation can only take you so far. We could potentially be looking at where do we relocate communities where the impacts of climate change are not going to impact on their livelihoods as badly.
I'll ask you one last question, and this as a human, not a politician. Sorry to all the politicians out there, but from an emotional sense. With the work that you do, are you hopeful or do you feel hopeless most days? Where does your heart tell you we're headed?
Sure. I've been playing in this space for quite a while now, and it is challenging to remain optimistic. But I am an optimist inherently, and I do think that there is, a positive way out of this. I think there's a lot of opportunities that climate change provides as well, that a lot of people aren't really looking at that side because we're so focused on the negatives. But there are opportunities. I mean, some places are going to get wetter, and there are opportunities for, storing water in areas and distributing it to the areas that are going to be become drier. Yeah.
There is hope, my friend, there is hope. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us and sharing some of your, what seems like very vast knowledge in this space. We really do appreciate that. And we've seen it here in Cape Town, regardless of the conditions and no matter how dire our future is looking, those tough times bring out the best in us, and never forget that there is always hope. There is always something we can do as individuals, certainly here in South Africa.